E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e nā kārangaranga maha o te rau. Tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ko te tikanga o te kuretini o tākau, ki te timatea tā tātou hui rangahau, mai te tahi karakia. Ka inu katoa. Whakarongo rai rongo ki te pukenga. Te mana wane ki te rongo take take, te whiwhia, te rawea, te whiwhia nuku, whiwhia rangi. Whiwhia takia mai e te kāhui o ngā ariki, kia tuturu, ka whakamau ai kia tina, tina. Umia hui e, tai kiri. On behalf of the College of Workplace Learning and Welfare, our congratulations. Tēnā koe. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora koutou. Haere mai, welcome to all here tonight at the Te Pukenga ki Otago for Professor Yvonne Thomas's Inaugural Professorial Lecture. My name is Leonie Schmidt. I'm the Director for Research and Postgraduate Studies at here at Otago, and it's an honour for me to be here tonight to welcome you all to this really special event. The position of a full professor is the highest in academia and educational institutions across the world. And out of this fact grew the age-old tradition of inaugural lectures. They are a way of celebrating success of our colleagues, and we're here to do that tonight with Yvonne, but also of introducing the professor to the wider community of research and teaching practice, and of also providing the public with insights into how and why public monies are spent on the position. So this is all the reasons why we have inaugural professorial lectures over the ages. So the rationale has to do with community, with communication, with accountability, and also with celebration. And each time we offer a professorial inaugural lecture here, a different and quite distinct community engages on our campus. Tonight we have members of the occupational therapy community and also from other health areas here. Welcome to all of you. This discipline, occupational therapy, is an important one within the larger College of Health and Wellbeing here, and it's also important in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In our unique context, in which it is crucial to support people into occupations and help them to remain in those occupations. Yvonne, I'm looking forward to learning more about the discipline of occupational therapy tonight and about your own position and your role in this field. Over to Marion Gray, Professor Marion Gray now for the formal introduction to your lecture. And I will be coming back here at the end of the evening to thank everybody. Thank you.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Marianne Gray. My current academic position is Associate Dean Health Partnerships at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. In line with the theme of Yvonne's address today, I acknowledge the importance of belongingness and home to our sense of well-being and identity. From my perspective, I am a Kiwi and will always consider Otago to be my home. Today though, I'm speaking to you from my second home, Gubbi Gubbi land in southeast Queensland, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I recognise the sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country and to all the custodians of the lands you are gathering on for this wonderful event. I'm very honoured that Yvonne has asked me to do the introduction for her inaugural professorial address, and I hope I can do it the justice it deserves. I am an occupational therapist, a researcher and teacher, and thankfully during the majority of my almost 30 years in academia, I've had the opportunity to be both a student and colleague of Yvonne's across various times, settings and countries. I will make mention of the beginning of our association as it fits with the title of her address this evening. I was one of the second cohort to train at Otago Occupational Therapy School, and it was during my training when I first met Yvonne. She was at the time a passionate practitioner. Yvonne was my clinical supervisor in a placement at a mother and baby unit in Christchurch, and it was her expert demonstration of what an OT could do to transform the lives of people with mental illness which inspired me to later go on to become a mental health OT. Yvonne continued to inspire future OTs when she came to work at Otago OT School, and we later became colleagues when I returned to work with her post-graduation in the fieldwork team. I moved on to further study, but fast forward to 2004 and we again became colleagues in occupational therapy education, this time in a different country. We worked together for a time as lecturers at James Cook University in Townsville. This is where the next theme of her title emerges, compassionate researcher. During our time at JCU, I was privileged to be part of Yvonne's PhD journey as one of her supervisors. I will talk more about some of her PhD work as it's integral in terms of the development of the field of OT in the area of homelessness. The importance of home is a major thread that Yvonne will be talking to you about this evening. At the time Yvonne was undertaking her PhD work, though, few others in OT had looked into this important area. Whilst there have been many since, Yvonne was certainly a pioneer and her work is frequently cited. Both of us moved on from JCU and Yvonne became the course lead at the University of Worcester in the UK. Nearly 30 years on, our career paths have crossed again, with both of us returning home to our OT academic roots, Otago Occupational Therapy School, with me as external program moderator and Yvonne as professor and research coordinator. I only have a short time to describe to you the highlights of Yvonne's impressive career, so I'll briefly reiterate how impactful an OT educator she is. Having educated thousands of students and subsequent health professionals over her 28 years, over 3 countries, clearly there are a great deal of OT practitioners who have been influenced by her and her immense contribution to the profession of occupational therapy across the globe. I always feel that it's a privilege being a supervisor on a PhD project where I am merely a sounding board and the candidate becomes the expert. During my time as a supervisor on Yvonne's PhD journey, I'm sure I learned more from her than she did from me. I thought I would take the last couple of minutes to highlight to you one paper from Yvonne's extensive list. And I'm familiar with this paper as a co-author, and it also fits with the theme of her talk for this evening, that is the importance of home. It is entitled An Exploration of the Subjective Wellbeing Among People Experiencing Homelessness, a Strengths-Based Approach. I chose this paper from an impressive list of 7 from her PhD work, mainly because it's one of the most highly cited to date and because it reflects the broader multidisciplinary reach of her work. She used the strengths-based approach at the time, which was more commonly drawn upon by social work, to help us understand how we can improve the well-being of people who are homeless. This paper highlighted that it's the negative perceptions of people who aren't homeless that are contributing to the diminishing well-being of those who are. Services that provide opportunities to experience social inclusion and develop community and cultural connections will improve the well-being of people who are homeless. Because this work brought together discourse from different disciplines, it is both impactful within and outside of the profession. One example of the broad impact this work has had is its incorporation into the report by the Lowitja Institute at the ANU. The report is entitled Changing the Discourse of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health and Wellbeing. The Institute is the academic think tank the government relies upon when devising policy. Yvonne's work being included in this document is a testament to the lasting impact and the changing practice and circumstances for homeless people and First Nations people in Australia and beyond. I wish I had more time to tell you about the other things that I learned from Yvonne over the many years I've known her, but I will finish here so that you can get to hear from her directly. To conclude, I cannot think of a more worthy recipient of the honour of joining your professoriate via this inaugural address. You're very lucky to have her, and I'm sure she will continue to lead and inspire those around her. As the title of her address indicates, Yvonne is both passionate and compassionate about her profession and has dedicated her career to help others understand and share in this vision. I'm one of those people, and I'm very glad our paths have crossed so many times. May they continue to do so into the future. So congratulations, Yvonne, in the acknowledgement of your achievements, and I hope you all enjoy your evening. Goodbye for now.
I guess it's my turn now. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Leonie, and thank you, Marion, for that wonderful introduction and start for the evening. I'm absolutely. What's the matter? Okay. If you can't hear me, please wave at the back. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everyone here this evening, particularly as it feels like it's a collection of my family, friends, colleagues, and the people that I really like to talk to. So it's lovely to have you here, and I'm very pleased that you've given up what's a lovely evening to be here tonight. Tēnā koutou, ko ingarani te tura kawaiwai I tipu aki au ki Warwickshire. I rara e te maru e te mauka o Cotswolds, I te taha o te awa o Avon, ki te noho au ki Otipoti. Ko Thomas Ratau, ko Cartwright Kefano, ko Tom Rua, ko Colleen Kamatua, ko a Tenei, ko Yvonne, toko ikwau, no reira tēnā koutou katau. So I come from the land of Shakespeare. I didn't get his writing ability. My hills are not, my mountains are not mountains. My hills are the Cotswolds, which are quite high and very scenic. And my river is the River Lem, which actually is a small tributary and flows into the Avon. The Avon goes into the Severn goes to the Bristol Channel and out to the Atlantic. And that flow of that river is a bit like the flow of my career. I want to mention Tom and Colleen, my parents, and before them, their parents, Maud, Reginald and Elsie. And between them, that is my whānau. Like many Pākehā, I don't go back further than that, really. There is a genealogy, but these are the people that created my home. They created the best childhood that I think any child could want, and it is to them that I want to dedicate tonight's presentation. They didn't have much money, they had an awful lot of love, and what they did was bless their children with big dreams and the confidence to actually try to achieve whatever you want to in life, and our family did that in spades. So when I started to plan, when I started to plan this lecture, I thought, well, you know, what's a professorial lecture like? What do you do? So I've watched a few. I did the obligatory Google, what makes a good professorial lecture? It didn't really come up with very much at all, so I did a bit of research. So I posted that question on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on my Twitter page and sent a few emails to people. I got 29 responses, which I thought was really good, but they're all, you know, basically my friends. And they gave me a whole load of ideas about what should be included. My niece, bless her, said that a good professorial lecture would be one where a black poodle arrives, and so we bought the dog. We also I had some other comments, one from a very good friend who said, just be yourself, but without the swearing. But mainly, as you can see, the big advice was tell stories, make this personal and professional, recognise the people that have helped you, be authentic, and inspire the next generation. And in a nutshell, a really wonderful Professor Lisa Jones, who I worked with in Worcester, probably one of the most generous and humble professors I have ever come across. She gave me this quote: "Tell stories about yourself, your career, stories about the people who've helped, stories about your research, about what you're planning to do next, stories about what you've learned and your advice to younger academics looking for inspiration." So I'm hoping that I've included some of that in this presentation. I'm not very funny, so you might just have to check you might laugh when you think it's appropriate. I've separated this into 4 sections. The first section I really want to talk about is about home, and I'm going to talk about my home, but also explore meanings of home. And then I'm going to go through my career from that occupational therapy practitioner, the educator years, and then the researcher years. And each of those different sections, I'm going to look at home from a different angle. So this won't be a surprise to many, but I was born in a pub. And this was the Rugby Tavern. I was actually 1 year old when we left the pub, and I moved into this house with my family down here, 13 Stonehouse Close, Covington. And this was my family home, and it stayed my family home until the 1990s. I'd long since left, but I used to go back on a regular basis. In fact, when I go back to England, I always drive past it. It was our family home, and in that home, I was the last of 6 siblings. But when I think of that home, I was really, really blessed, as I've said. When I think about that home, I think not just about the bricks and mortar. I think about the family. I think about the streets around, the playgrounds, the church, the little school that I went to with my sister Diane. You'll see my primary school photo. Oh, wasn't I cute? And I think also about those routines, those things that happen as part of home. So Christmases, birthdays, there was a village carnival, there was a Christmas pantomime. There were things that happened every year and that I could rely on. And Tom and Colleen were always there. And this is Tom and Colleen on the day that I left New Zealand for the first time, basically because I didn't want to get married and I needed to do something that they thought was worthwhile. Oh, now, a bit of a warning here. I was blessed, and I'm very much aware that my home story is not the same as everybody else's. So if you didn't have a nice home as a child, please don't think of that home now. Think of the home that you've created. Think of the homes that you have been to where you have felt welcomed and loved. Think about homes that you dream for yourself in the future. But what I want you to do is to just reflect for a few moments on what the meaning of home is for you. So I've got some questions there. Where is your home? So we know that home for me at the moment, I'm talking about Covington, but I've had lots of homes. And sometimes I think New Zealand is more my home now than England ever was. So you might have lots of homes. What makes these places homes? Think of the people, the things that are connected with that home, the things that you bring with you when you move from one home to another. How do you experience home? What are the memories that come up for you and what arises? And finally, how does home support your identity? How do you experience yourself in home and your purpose at home? I'm not going to ask questions. You're all right. So I asked some of those questions to a group of occupational therapists in Queensland many years ago. And I do like a good word cloud, as you can see. And what they came up with was these sort of words. So here we get this idea of a place, a house, a place of safety, of sanctuary, of refuge, somewhere you can walk around in your undies. a place to rejuvenate. And then the people, the family, the friends, the wife, the boys, the children, the daughter, myself, the people that make up home. And then the feelings, love, happy, pride, spirit, peace, fun, memories. And finally, in the very small print, belonging, sharing, life, creating, and the everyday. So I'm going to talk about some of those things. The literature on home is quite extensive and supports the idea that home is multifaceted. And it's not just the house, it's not just the bricks and mortar. Although Bunnings, Mitre 10 and the grand design would have us believe that it's all about the architecture. It's not. So I'm going to consider home in three ways. And the first way I'm going to consider it is as a space for our occupation. So being at home is how we create our home. We make our home by living in it, by creating those routines, by doing those activities and those occupations that are meaningful. So whether that's gardening, or whether that's painting the wall, or whether that's playing with the children, we create home as a space for occupation. The second way I want to think about it is home as a connection to family, but also a connection to myself. A connection to my identity, who I am and who I can become. And the third way I want to look at it is at home as belonging. And this is this intangible aspect of home that creates and imbibes meaning for us. So if you like, this is our sense of home and ourselves and our connections between us as individual and our environment. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, that idea of connection and belonging. So now I'm going to go to the passionate occupational therapist bit. This was my graduation photograph. You can see Tom and Colleen there, a bit older. No, a bit younger, sorry. My best friend Mandy was there, my flatmate and the girl that I did my study with all for 3 years, and she shared a room with me for 3 years, Jane, and her punk brother Andy. Those were the days of big hair. I'm going back, I think. My own occupational therapy training was very different to the training that we do now. I was trained in the art and craft of occupational therapy. I did basket weaving, I did weaving on a loom, I can print on an Adana print machine, which you've probably never seen. I can do archery, croquet, or I could then. So there was lots about my training that we don't even think about putting into the curriculum now. What I did get was a real sense of an understanding of occupation. And that's the core philosophy. Oh, am I going backwards? Okay, so just to kind of bring you up to speed in terms of occupational therapy philosophy, we no longer profess to be basket weavers, although perhaps that will come round again, because you know how these things keep coming round. Occupational therapy is founded on the concept that occupation is essential to human existence and good health and well-being. So we as a pack of occupational therapists believe that we can sustain and maintain our good health and well-being through our occupations. And we're not just talking about work here, we're talking about all of the things that we do that make life meaningful. Work is part of that, but a lot of what we do isn't about work or employment or for monetary gain. A lot of our occupations are for our own enjoyment and benefit, or for the benefit of other people. So in New Zealand, the Board of New Zealand has this to say about the core aim of occupational therapy. We support people and whānau to have a life they value through enabling occupation and inclusion in society. We advocate for the rights, responsibilities and opportunities of all people and whānau to engage in occupations. Human rights, occupational And social justice, equity and sustainability are core principles of the profession. And this is what I'm passionate about. To me, it's the social justice agenda of occupational therapy, and the promoting the opportunities for people to be able to engage in occupations that make me passionate. Now, when I trained, this was just about people with disabilities, but the scope is now much wider, and we look at lots of different people in society with that social justice perspective and lens, and now occupational therapists are working in a wide range of different areas. I said that occupation is more than work, but I want to think about occupation in 3 different ways that we use it in everyday language. Perhaps not every day, but we do use it in 3 different ways. Now, obviously, the first way is occupation as doing. So we think about occupation in terms of we are occupying. We are being occupied by the things that we do. Sometimes we're doing too much, sometimes we're doing too little, but we are doing what we need to do or are obliged to do or want to do, and that's our occupation. The second way I want to talk about occupation is in terms of the use of time. So when we think about occupation and being occupied, we think about how we spend our time, how our time might spread out in front of us, and we might need to fill our time if we are socially deprived in some way. So if we're isolated or we're depressed, we might have long days to fill with occupations or not. Or if we're busy working people, we may have far too much to do in a short space of time. And so our time goes quickly when we are fully occupied. And sometimes when we're occupied in those times of doing something when we're occupied by doing something that's really important to us or really enthralling to us, sometimes we get that sense of time standing still. We forget ourselves because we're so absorbed. And that's often called flow. I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to talk about this last version of occupation, and that is the idea that occupation is about transforming and using space. So I might be an occupant of my house or of my office. I take space, I use space, I transform space through my occupations. And it is through those occupations that are related to space, for instance, think about gardening, that you develop a connection. So I'm connected to my land, I'm connected to my world through my occupations in space. And that's what we're going to talk about in terms of home. Now, I said I was a passionate occupational therapist. When I trained, naturally it was after I trained, when I was a new occupational therapist, there was a lot of things to be passionate about. So I worked all week as an occupational therapist, but I was one of those people that went down to London in big buzzes at the weekend. I was anti almost everything. I was anti-racist, I was anti-nuclear, I was anti-Thatcher, I was pro-abortion, I was sometimes anti-abortion as well, but let's not go there. I was angry about a lot of things, and I took that out on society generally at the weekend by walking down Oxford Street or congregating in Hyde Park. I was also passionate about the work that I did as an occupational therapist, and when I look back, one of the things that occupational therapists do, or certainly used to do a lot more, but I think still do, is that we do the home visit. Now, I think as occupational therapists we take this a bit for granted, but I was very lucky working in mental health because I was the person that was able to take somebody who had been admitted into an acute mental health ward, and I was able to take them home. Now, nobody else got this privilege, but it was part of my job, and the idea was that you could take people home and you could see how they would manage at home. In those days, we used to have the sort of weekend away as well. So you could be admitted onto a ward, but you could have a weekend at home and see how you'd manage. But before that happened, the occupational therapist would take you and do a home visit and see how people managed in their own environment. And often, as an occupational therapist, I realised that taking people home meant that I saw more of that person. I understood that person more. All the OTs are going like this. So I had some great jobs as an occupational therapist, but I want to tell you a story, and this is my first story. A story about a woman that I met in my very first job on acute mental health in Sheffield. And I'm going to call her Claire, because I actually can't remember what her name was. But a picture of her will never leave me. So Claire had what was called psychotic depression with catatonia. So she was very, very depressed to the point of being mute. She was totally withdrawn. And the catatonia bit was that she could move freely, but she would often get literally physically stuck in a catatonic state. So often she would be sitting on her bed, mute, expressionless, not responding to anything around her, and completely still. As an occupational therapist, this was my first job, I couldn't really do anything. I couldn't engage Claire at all. I couldn't get her involved in any of the activities that I was supposed to do as an occupational therapist on the ward. She didn't want to join in. She didn't even want to talk to people. And one day I met her in the corridor and she was stuck. She'd walked down the corridor away from the ward, and she was in literally a catatonic position. She was just still. And so I thought, well, I'll need to take her back to the ward at least. So I tried pulling her hands and I tried pulling her towards me. But she wasn't budging. Now, this woman was, knee high. She was about 5 foot high, very, very skinny, weighed nothing. I could not budge her. And so in a bit of desperation, and not wanting to give up here, I sort of sidled round to the side of her and I just put my arm around her. And she melted. She literally melted into me. And so she'd released her sort of stronghold on staying still, and so I was able to very gently move her forward. And we walked very gently back to the ward, and I just talked to her all the time, just coaxing her, encouraging her. And when we got back to the bed, I realised there were tears rolling down her face. And I had never seen any emotion being expressed at all by this woman. So I sat down with her on her bed and I said, "Claire, what do you want?" And she said, "I want to go home." So at the next multidisciplinary meeting, I got brave, talked to the consultant and said no one else had any ideas what to do with Claire. And I said, well, she wants to go home, so why don't I just take her on a home visit? And nobody thought to argue. So we went off, I ordered a taxi, I found her front door key, which was in the safe for safekeeping. We got a bit of money together and off we went to her house. And she lived in a typical Sheffield terraced house. I gave her the key, she opened the door to her own house. She walked into her house and re-engaged with her home. I watched her walk through the rooms, recognising things. I watched her picking up pictures of people. I asked her who those people were. I watched her. It was an amazing thing to watch as I watched her literally come back to life in front of my eyes. And then she walked out the back garden. So I followed, thinking, where the hell's she going? And the neighbour had obviously seen her come home, and so the neighbour had rushed into the back garden. The neighbour called her over, Claire, how are you? How are you going? And so suddenly they were chatting. I'd never seen anything like this from Claire before. Anyway, long story short, we went to the butcher's. She talked to the butcher's. She bought herself a chop. She went to the corner shop, bought some potatoes and peas. She cooked herself a meal in her own pots and pans, probably enjoyed this meal more than any meal that she'd had for weeks and weeks, and she was on her way home. And hope was there, but it was about her engaging back in her house. So that was Claire. I had lots of jobs where as an OT I visited people in their own home, and I saw things when I was working with mothers and babies and I used to go and visit people in their own home. You could see how the baby had taken over the whole house. You could see how life had changed, and you could see that there was no space for the woman to be. You could see how they were managing their daily activities. And this has been really quite a strong theme in my profession. So I'll move on to this second part, which is the bit of the the educator. So I actually started in my education career here at Otago Polytechnic as a fieldwork coordinator, and I remember the interview that I had with the head of occupational therapy. The first head of the occupational therapy school was a woman called Linda Wilson. She was an amazing woman, and she was an absolute inspiration, and she was also a brilliant educator. After my interview, which didn't go very well because I had a panic attack in the middle of it, she called me over at the end and she said, "So Yvonne, I just want to ask one more question. What do you feel about giving up your occupational therapy career and taking on an academic career?" And I laughed at her and said, "No, not me. I'm always going to be an occupational therapist." 30 years later, I guess I have become an academic, and being a professor sort of kind of confirms that, but I've never stopped being an occupational therapist, and I don't think I ever will. In my educator career, I started doing research. And I did research in different areas, and I'm not really going to talk a huge amount of all the research that I've done. It sounds terrible, all the research I've done. I'm not going to talk about a lot of it, but I just thought, just to give you a bit of a flavour, there'd be two areas of research that I have done as an educator. The first area was really around practice education or fieldwork placements. That was what I was employed to do in education, and I was interested to find out how people learned in practice education, but also how we could extend what practice education might be. So my research was about new models of practice education, new models of learning in the field, and inspiring supervisors, encouraging supervisors to offer more placements, but also to develop what was called role emerging placements. And that's really been my contribution to the profession in terms of an educator. I still do research in that area, and I'm very pleased. You'll see here, my first viewpoint article was with a woman called Merrily Penman, who used to work at Otago Polytechnic and now works at the Curtin University in Perth. And we're still working together, and we're working with Jackie, who's in the audience from the University of Sydney, and we're still looking at practice education. So that was my first area of research, and you'll see none of these are sole authors. I've always worked with groups of women, mostly women, groups of occupational therapists and we've done research together, and I've learnt so much from the people that I have worked with over the years. You'll see the name Sylvia Rogers there, who was a head at the University of Queensland, and she was such a brilliant mentor for me as a researcher in those early years. My second area of research as an educator was around the values and professional identity of occupational therapists, but particularly how do we encourage and empower and enable our students to become professional in their identity. So there was a mixture of articles there about students becoming professional and about the sort of attributes of professionals in practice in remote communities, and more recently I've looked at values of occupational therapists. But this is a piece of research that I did a long time ago, and it keeps coming back to me, and I kind of think I need to redo this research, because this piece of research was conducted in 2009 or 8 or something like that, 2009, and it was we got funding from the Queensland Occupational Therapy Board to look at what keeps people in the profession for the long run. So it was about longevity. Professor Michelle Clark was my mentor, and she worked with me on this project, and we had 3 final year students who worked with us. And what we did was we interviewed occupational therapists who'd been in the job for 15 years or more. And we asked them, the research question was, what factors kept you in your professional career as an occupational therapist? And we grouped the answers into the longevity, so 15 to 20 years, 20 to 25 years, 25 to 30 years, and then those that had been in the job more than 30 years. When I did this research, I thought 30 years in one profession, and now I'm at that angle, so this is fine. The 4 themes that came out were basically OT's a really good job to be in, especially for women. It's really flexible. You can have children and come back to it. There's diversity, there's specialist experience and all that. So I'm not trying to sell occupational therapy here, but it's a good job to be in. The second bit was the workplace. So people like their workplaces, they like the opportunities and the support they got, the resources, the control, the autonomy, etc. The third theme, then, the personal bit, was a challenge. People could learn more. You can always learn more, and so people had that personal challenge, their ability to be able to get recognition and thanks and know that they were making a difference. But it was this 4th theme that's really, if you like, it's really intrigued me over a long period of time. And we found it more in those people that have been in the profession 25 or plus years. But it was the philosophy aspect that really sits, it really is illuminated by this. People who've been in the profession for a long time didn't see a difference between themselves as a person and themselves as a professional. That their identity as a person and their identity as a professional was melded. And the one thing that would make people leave jobs at this stage in the career was where they couldn't be authentic in their work. So my thinking here, when I think about home, and I'm coming back to the theme, I promise, my thinking here is that actually a profession can be a home as well. You can engage in your profession and feel so comfortable and so supported in that profession, but also that you contribute to the profession, that becomes part of your home. The last part of my journey has been as a compassionate researcher, and this is where I start getting serious about the research, because I get encouraged by Marion Gray when I invited her for dinner one night in my front room. She was the one who said, "You've got to do a PhD, Yvonne." And I said, "No, I can't do a PhD, I'm not clever enough for that." She said I could. She was right, and if I can do a PhD, anybody can do a PhD, honestly. I'm going to come back to the bit about compassion at the end and explain why I've used that title. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD research, which was with homeless people, as Marion's already said. My occupational mind said that if you can engage in occupations, you can sustain your well-being and maintain your well-being. But the question that arose for me is, if I were homeless, if I didn't have a job, if I didn't have a family, if I didn't have the opportunities or the resources to do occupations, then how could I sustain my well-being? How could I maintain my well-being in that situation? And it was that question that I took to my PhD. It was in Townsville, so this may have very little relevance to us, to New Zealand, so I might need to redo some research here and see if it is similar. But my research was a fairly lengthy kind of case study of homelessness in Townsville. But the bit I want to talk to you about is the interviews. So I did interviews with, what I did was I loitered with intent around homelessness services. So I spent 2 years going to homeless services at least once a week, just hanging around, just being there. There was an art group in one service that I joined in another service that I used to take muffins in the morning and just talk to people. But I just loitered until people, and I observed, but until people felt comfortable, and I felt comfortable to ask them if they would like to be part of my research. And they were very generous, incredibly generous people with their understanding. I went to these places, I'll rush past that. There was a drop-in centre, a diversionary centre, which was basically a place where people could go when they were drunk at night and they were brought back to town in the morning. And that was specifically for Indigenous people, but not exclusively for Indigenous people. And then there were family emergency accommodations in Townsville. I only had one criteria, and that was, do you perceive yourself as being homeless? That was the only criteria I was interested in. And then I did 32 interviews of 29 people. 32 interviews because 2 of the Aboriginal people came back to me on 2 or 3 occasions. And I believe what they were doing was their first interview, they were just testing me out. They were just making sure I was, okay. And then when I was still hanging around after that for a while, then they'd say, that interview? I'd like to do another one. And then they'd tell me a bit more. And one person did that 3 times. Very generous. But what I found as I started collecting people's information about their homeless existence and their occupations, there were different stories. It wasn't that I could do a thematic analysis. I tried that, but I couldn't do a thematic analysis across all 29 interviews because there were 3 different stories there. So I wrote this up as 3 collective narratives. The first one was single male homelessness, and this was your archetypal rough sleeper, white Australian, 45 to 65 years old were my participants. They'd been on the streets for a wee while, quite a long while, and they were rugged. The second group was the first Australian homelessness. I had 10 males and 4 females. Their stories were very similar. And so that was a collective story about someone who was Aboriginal. And the third group was the mothers with children. And that group were as much smaller, 5 women, and much younger, between the ages of 22 and 28. And I'm going to tell you their stories now, very quickly. So Stuart is 52 years old and he comes from Adelaide. He became homeless when he was separated from his wife, and he has a son, but he has no contact with his son now because he's a long way away and he doesn't keep contact. He moved to Queensland because he had previously visited the area and has some family here. I just want to reiterate, this is not a person. This is 10 interviews, okay? I'm not telling you about Stuart really. He's been living on the streets for 8 years. Occasionally he goes to a hostel, but he doesn't like the hostel. He doesn't like the rules. He tends to get himself chucked out of those kind of places. He once did have a flat. The services found him somewhere to live, but it was too much responsibility, and he just didn't want to be tied down to rent and paying bills and all the rest of it. So he likes living on the streets. The streets of Townsville are where he lives. He knows everybody. He's a very jovial sort of chap, and the police know him well. He doesn't really get into trouble, and he doesn't really feel he'd gain anything from having a place of his own. So when I asked him about his occupations, the first one's survival. Finding somewhere to stay, finding some food to eat, that's the first thing, and trying to keep clean. That's hard when you're homeless. And most of the homeless people have got beards because it's really hard to shave. He then talked about filling time. So his days are slow, but he does a lot of walking, and he'll do the same route over every day. So he meets the same people. And often when he's walking and he's meeting those people, they don't know he's homeless. So he's perfectly able to just pass the time of day. He also reads, and when he can, he does a bit of work for money at the drop-in centre, and that helps to support his third habit, which is drinking. No, that's this fourth one, breaking the boredom. Alcohol was much more of a strategy for breaking the boredom, having a routine. So for him, his day would revolve around trying to get enough money together and then planning what sort of drink he was going to buy and then drinking in the evening, and that would help him to sleep at night. He didn't mind going to having a drink with other people, so on paydays that was, you know, go to the pub with other people, but usually he was very careful to make sure he had enough money to have a drink every day, and that would be something he would do on his own. He got a couple of mates, but he basically didn't trust anybody. But what he did have were these cognitive strategies where he would manage his mood. Excellent philosopher was Stuart. He told me that if you wake up and say it's going to be a bummer, it's going to be a bummer. And if you wake up and say, hey, I didn't die in the night, I'm going to have a good day. And there were all these little strategies that people used in order to keep them there, keep his mood buoyant and to make sure that he didn't go down. Chris is a 45-year-old Aboriginal man who's lived on the streets for 6 years. He originally came from a remote community, but he actually attended school in Townsville, living with family friends, and he returned to the community in the holidays as a child. So he had a strong connection with Townsville. He worked around Queensland on the railways for a while when he was younger, and he has a partner and a child on the Aboriginal community. But there was trouble in the community, and he got arrested and he got put in jail. So after his stint in jail, he went back to the community, but he found that he wasn't really welcome there. His partner had moved on, his mum, who his partner lived with, didn't really want him there, and there was problems in terms of him being there because of what had happened. And so he came to Townsville where he feels like he knows people, and he's been living in the parks since then. For Chris, again, survival's important. He's got to find food and he's got to find somewhere to sleep. But for him, being with other people, being with his Aboriginal mob, his name, not mine, that was where he belonged. So being with the mob, sitting in the parks, yarning, drinking, having a laugh, that was when he felt most at home. Now, that's fine, but in Townsville you're not allowed to do that if you're a group of Aboriginal people, and you get moved on. And so one of the things that was really important for him was avoiding getting into trouble with the police. And in a way, Aboriginal homelessness has been criminalised in Townsville, so they are always wary of police and security coming, having their bags searched. If they're found with alcohol, it will be taken off them. If they're abusive to the police, then they'll be put into custody. So this marginalisation was part of being criminalised. But when that wasn't happening, he liked time on his own. He was a man who'd go to the beach, and he was getting into the artwork, so he was in the art programme as well. So he really liked time on his own to reflect, and it was something cultural for him to be able to do art. And lastly, Julia. Julia is a 25-year-old woman with 2 children who became homeless when her rental accommodation was sold by the landlord. Townsville had a very buoyant rental market, and being homeless, needing to find a rental when you've got no income and 2 children made her not a very desirable tenant. So she found it very difficult to find somewhere else to live. And she was in emergency accommodation with her children when I saw her. And she was a bright woman who had had a lot of misfortune in her life. But not surprisingly, she had herself been fostered, and she had her foster parents were in Townsville. She got quite a good relationship with her foster parents. So she'd had a very transient home life herself. Now her story is quite different, actually. She talked about keeping going. Keeping going was really important. Keeping going, getting up, getting one of her children to school, getting meals, doing the housework, just keeping going, keeping going. She had to do that for her children. Her identity was all about being a mother. And she felt at this stage that she was a bit of a failure of a mother because she hadn't been able to give them the secure home that she knew that children needed. So in order to maintain their security, she just kept going. She was kept going at trying to find a house as well. That was her daily occupation, was looking for homes, applying for housing. She was getting some help with that, but she knew it was going to be difficult. And differently to Chris and Stuart, she had a plan. She had a plan that once she'd got somewhere safe to live, she wanted to start some part-time study. She wanted to get her employment opportunities improved so she could get an income and she could give the children the security that they wanted. But she was really stuck at this point when she was homeless. And for her, it was about managing stress as well. So she told me a lovely story. When the kids are in bed and everyone's asleep and it's quiet, I put the music on and I dance, was what she told me. It's 3 very different stories about homelessness. But if we think about that from the idea of what is home, for Stuart, Townsville's home, the streets are his home. He's happy living on the streets. And he identifies as a survivor. He's a street survivor. For Chris, home was with his mob. The people that he loved, and he called them family. He felt alienated from other people, excluded from the rest of Townsville society, and avoiding trouble with the police was really important, but home was with the mob. And for Julia, home was with her children. She was into trying to keep everybody safe, keep the family together and provide that security. And her identity was very much as a mother. Now that research, actually, what Marion just said is the first I'd heard of it. That research is out there in papers and it is picked up a bit by other people, but I didn't realise that it was in a government document, which is really great to hear. What I did think though was there's more to homelessness than giving people a roof. When I was doing my research in Australia, the Australian government had just put out a great big white paper about, halving homelessness by 2020. I'm telling you, they won't have achieved that. There's no way they've achieved that, especially post-COVID. It'll be on the increase. However, there's lots of ways in which governments try to address homelessness, and one of them is called Housing First. And the Housing First model is very simple. They simply take out all the beginning steps to getting permanent housing. So normally in the services, if you were homeless and if you qualified for housing and if somebody thought you would be a reasonable go in terms of being a tenant, you'd start off with a hostel or shared house. You'd then go into temporary housing with a whole heap of conditions about not having alcohol or drugs or bad neighbour, the neighbours not complaining about you, etc., etc. Eventually you get a permanent rental contract. Housing First takes out all of those stages and just takes people off the street and puts them into permanent housing with support. So this is a model that was being talked about and has been talked about in lots of countries, in Europe, in America, etc., etc. When I went to Worcester at the university there, I started working with a hostel, and the hostel manager and I had a reasonable relationship, and they were starting to think about, could they start a Housing First project? COVID struck and changed everything, because suddenly the government had $3.8 million to take homeless people off the streets and put them into hotels. They did it because of COVID. But it gave the services a great opportunity to go and meet with those people on a daily basis, support those people in the hotels. When COVID restrictions then lessened, lots of those people went back to the streets, but some of those people had already got good relationships. So they were able to help to move those people from hotels into permanent housing and support them. And I was able to get the tender to do the evaluation of this project. And the evaluation's going on. A colleague of mine, Peter Unwin, is still carrying on with that evaluation. But I did the first lot of the evaluation. And we had a survey, but I did some interviews of people who'd been housed for 6 months. There were 4 of them. 4 people I interviewed. One was in drug rehab and very happy. He was very, very happy. He was going to be in the rehab hostel for the next 12 months, and he was on his way. Another man was happy, thought he was in a great little house, really loving it, loving his garden, but unfortunately his neighbours weren't loving him. He didn't know that, but his neighbours were having all sorts of problems with him. But there were 2 people who were not happy at all, and these are 2 quotes. So participant one says, well, nowhere's home. I mean, it's just a place to live. It's just a place to live, basically. That's all. It's not home. Not home. And then she went on to say, well, anywhere can be your home. I mean, home's where you lay your hat. And then later, I mean, you can't get stuck in one area, can you, all your life? Stuck in one place, can you? She wasn't going to stay in that home, I don't think. She may change her mind, but as far as I could see at that point, she really wasn't going to stay in that home for very long. She felt very trapped in one place. Participant 3 was different. Participant 3 had a lot of pain. She was having daily, weekly trips from visits from district nurses. She had a physical problem and she had a lot of pain. But she was also desperately trying not to get back onto drink. And so she had a home and she felt quite safe in there, but she wasn't relating to any of the neighbours. She'd say hello to them but I'd just keep it at that. I feel weak and I don't want to be in any kind of situation with drinking. So she wasn't able to engage in her network. So where does this leave me? So I'm getting to the end now, honestly, I promise. If you think about in terms of home clearly isn't just a physical building. It's not about a roof. It's about a connection. It's about a place where you can live and be yourself. It's about your connection to the people around you and your networks, and you're feeling part of that. And it's about having a place as this sense of belonging, that having a place where you can be the person that you can dream to be, that you can imagine yourself to be something other and work towards that. And that we've got a long way to go before we can manage that for people who are long-term homeless. We've got a lot of work to do to encourage people to take that step, to make the connections and to get that sense of belonging. And that's where I hope occupational therapy will go in the future. I said I'd come back to the bit about compassion. And for this I owe a very long, almost 6-year probably more than that, 10-year conversation with my sister. That's the other girl in the school photograph. My sister Diane Manage is a midwife and she did her PhD around compassion in midwifery. She knows much more about compassion than I do. But she says there's 3 parts to compassion. There is the recognising human suffering. And, you know, as occupational therapists, we do that, don't we? We recognise people who are in difficult situations. So there's recognising and noticing and being aware of human suffering and then being curious. And as a researcher, I think that's what it's about. It's about asking the question, being curious about somebody else's situation and really trying to understand that, being open to it. The second part of compassion is connecting with that experience of suffering. And so as a qualitative researcher, you have a great opportunity to find out and understand what suffering is like and how people perceive their lives and what they perceive they need. And then you're recognising that cognitively, you're connecting to that experience and you're writing about it. And this third part is about taking action to relieve and prevent suffering. And that's where the evidence comes in, I think. As a researcher, I think the evidence that you can provide will help to change services. It will help to give other people an opportunity to think, how could we do this differently? And so for me, being a researcher is about being compassionate, about understanding and giving that information in the form of evidence so that we can change services and improve people's lives. I think I'm going to finish there because I think I've said all those things. Thank you very much. I'm supposed to ask for questions at this point. And I'm here to answer questions if anybody's got any, but make them easy. And if not, we could end.
I don't have a question, Yvonne. You've answered all my questions, but I just want to say that it was fantastic and thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hello.
Do you think Craig needs a home?
Stuart
Stuart.
or Chris? Which one?
Oh,
Aboriginal?
Stuart.
Stuart? No, I don't think he does, actually. I think he needs the opportunity if he wants a home, but I think that actually, there's always been people that have been homeless. I think what we need to do is to make people who are homeless safe and give people an opportunity to have a wash and do the things that they need to do. But I don't think we need to make them conform. And I honestly think that the Stuarts I met their life would not be enhanced by having a house. I think their life would be enhanced by having opportunities to do the things that they want, need and are obliged to do. And to, you know, the thing that I kept thinking was we need a community garden here. We need something like that people can come to and be part of the community and not feel marginalised and be other. That's the thing that I think would make the difference. And somebody asked me it's a great question, Chris, because I'm just going to keep talking now. Somebody asked me at my PhD presentation the one thing I'd learned, and the one thing I'd learned was sit down and talk to someone who's homeless, because you'll probably learn something. Don't walk by. I mean, sometimes we have to walk by, and sometimes you're too busy. But actually, if you sit and talk to people, they are incredibly generous with their information. And, they're probably not so much after the money that they're asking for as the interaction, the conversation. Leslie?
I noticed that Stuart reported that drinking alcohol was a way of coping with his homelessness, and alcohol was also mentioned by Chris. Which came first, the homelessness or the drinking?
That's a good question. My own philosophy, my own thinking around this is that most of the people, I think, probably had trauma in their life somewhere along the line. And I think that the alcohol does two things. I think that it is something to hang on to, but it also numbs the pain. And I don't think that certainly there are alcoholics on the street. I'm not saying that there aren't people who've got alcoholic addictions, but I do think that the alcohol is a symptom of what's going on for people, not necessarily the problem. One of the things that all the research that I could find about homelessness when I first started doing this, it was all from that deficit model. And it was all about how much people drink, how mad they were, how many mental illnesses they could find, how uneducated they were and how they couldn't get a job. And actually it was all negative. But actually, for me, I wanted to find out what was the positive bits. We had one guy who was definitely, everyone would have said, alcoholic. And he used to come to the painting group on a Wednesday morning. And his painting initially was really, really big. He was an Aboriginal guy, and it was really, really big painting. And over time, he got much more refined. And one day I said to him, your painting's coming on. It's looking really good now. You've got a really nice style happening here. And he said, I found out that if I drink the night before I come to the art group, my hand shakes. So I stopped drinking on a Tuesday. Worked, his art was much better, but I don't think, if he was truly alcoholic, then that would have been really quite a stress for him. He voluntarily realised not drinking on a Tuesday was a good idea for his artwork. Yeah.
from your sample, roughly a third of the people are stewards. And so I guess my question is maybe two-part, is that how representative of any population, Australian or New Zealand or UK or wherever, do you think that those categories exist? And then why do governments focus, like you said, Australia was reduced homelessness by 50% or whatever your stat was, when there's 30% of the population that don't want to? And so, like, is there some sort of government strategy where, it sounds horrible and I don't mean it this way, but they can disregard those people and focus on the ones that do want a house or that will benefit from a house?
It's very good questions. I mean, there is a sort of natural need for society to look after the most vulnerable people, isn't there? We need to look after people who are vulnerable in our society, otherwise we'd be an uncivilised society. So I can't blame governments for wanting to house people who are homeless, because it seems like that's pretty basic. It's like treating people who are ill or educating kids. You know, you kind of want to have a society that does that, or at least aims to do that. I think, though, that we have a strong sense of people need to be in boxes and not necessarily homes, but we like people to conform to society's rules, and we don't really do very well with those people who don't conform. So for me, it's about accepting diversity and understanding that maybe the stewards of this world, maybe there was a point further back before they actually became entrenched street survivors, that something could have been done. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. And certainly for the Julias of this world, you know, if I had the power, any family that was, you know, in danger of becoming homeless with young children, they would be the priority. Don't let a child go through that unsettled childhood because we have unsettled adults. Having said that, some of the stewards, I have to say, had very settled childhoods. So something happened, and I think that was the trauma somewhere. Does that answer your question? Kind of.
Yeah, I also just want to know what you think the representation is of that population to other.
Don't know. What I can tell you is in Townsville there was a high population of Indigenous people, because and there was actually a high population of homeless people, because we were in the tropics. It's not a bad place to be homeless. You can sleep out all year round. You're not going to freeze to death, you know. Apart from the cyclones, it's fine. So, yeah, I think it was that town. I don't think we could necessarily say that would extrapolate everywhere. Somebody had a hand up. Laura.
Not about your research, but what advice, going back to your training, you trained to be an occupational therapist, what advice would you give your younger self, and has your view of occupation changed ever? Is that a hard one?
Oh yeah, that's definitely one for over a glass of wine, I think. I think the thing that I would say to my younger self, and I would say to any younger person, is, and I wished I'd have known this earlier, is that the limitations that you think you have created. You don't have those limitations if you don't think you have them. And that's what I didn't, it took me years to understand, that we create our own limitations in life. So when I thought of myself as an occupational therapist, I never thought of myself as an occupational therapy leader. But I do believe that over the years, I have been a leader in some ways, for some people at some times. But I would never have dreamt that. Never. Claire.
Thank you, Yvonne. That was really great and quite moving in places. I was wondering, I guess, as a fellow expat and someone who has lived and worked in different countries, has your perception or your beliefs about home changed
Yeah, and they're still changing. So in preparing for this lecture, I've probably thought more about home than I've ever thought about home in my life, and lots of different homes. The question that I have now is, how does this translate in New Zealand? How does this translate in New Zealand? My idea of home is, as I've said, it's a very Pākehā understanding. It's 2 generations. Lovely, but 2 generations. I don't feel that connection with a culture and a history that I know would be very important for Maori. So I don't know what I think about home relates to other cultures, and I wouldn't profess to understand that at this stage, but it's a question now. Something I'd love to find out, because I only have this idea of home as being actually... So I showed you the picture of the church. There are Norman pillars in that church, 10th century Norman pillars in that church, and that is what I think of when I think of history. I think of those pillars in that church where people have prayed and sung hymns for generations and generations and generations. But they're not, I mean, they are my people, but they're not people that I can name or know. Yeah, it's changed, and it needs to change again.
This is your inaugural professorial lecture.
It's my last professorial
But that's what I was going to ask, is research plans for the future?
Well, obviously more to do around homelessness in New Zealand. There's always research to do around education. It's a moving feast. So where's education going in the future? And what can we do to make it better and brighter? And how can we train more occupational therapists, I suppose? But I'm always open to offers, so if anyone's got any burning ideas, I'm very enthusiastic about research, so happy to get involved in most things. It's probably time we finished. I'm looking at the time and thinking, we should have been drinking a long time ago. If there's any other questions, I'm very happy to answer them over a drink. And thank you again, all of you, for coming. I really appreciate it. And this was so much nicer than I had dreamt. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. I think I speak for everybody in the room when I say that your lecture has provided us with a real opportunity to learn more about occupational therapy in surprising ways, and also, of course, its role in our communities. It's also been special to learn more about your own trajectory in the field. And your focus on home and homelessness reminds us all of our responsibilities in view of inequity and marginalisation in our own country and own contexts. Thank you for your careful research, and also I think as a person from the arts, for the well-craftedness, the engaging and the poetic way in which you've delivered this lecture. Thank you all for coming and sharing this special event with Yvonne and her family and her lovely familiar. And also from far away, thank you to Professor Marion Gray for introducing your lecture. Yvonne, if you could relay that message to her. And also a big thank you to Leslie Brooke and Rina Chan for organising this lovely event for us tonight. I am now going to hand over to Helen Papuni to end this evening off with a karakia, and then we can all move to that space over there where Leslie will do the karakia kai before we have a drink with you and your family. Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you. just before, while Helen sets up, can I just make one personal thanks to my brother who came from Australia for this talk and means a huge amount to me. It's me.
Katua ki au ki te whakakapi e tēnei kōrero nui mai a Professor Yvonne, mai tātou katoa me whakakapi tēnei wāhanga ki te tahi karekia. Ke inoi tātou. E mua koe a mātou iho e toto i a mātou mahi katoa. Ko koe whakakrori ai tō tātou mahi katoa. He mea tīmata, he mea mahi, he mea whakuotuati a koe. Ko i kraiti o ki tō mātou āriki. Āmene. Kia ora mai tātou.